and welcome to this podcast on electric mobility, an initiative by Cuts International and FES India. Today, we'll be talking about innovative finance as a driving push for electric mobility, and we have with us ourselves Ms. Suranjali Tandon. She's associate professor at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and Mr. Amit Bhandari. He's senior fellow at Gateway House looking after energy investment and connectivity. So before I begin any question, um, let me ask about your experience as a co-chair on T20 task force on clean energy and clean transition. What were the processes, mechanisms, any output, and how it helped create, a consensus in G20. And if it did not, then what the things that were lacking. So the whole process, if you can, discuss about that, so the audience is clear on those issues.
So, thank you, Akash. So, actually, the T20 process really started late in 2022 when the task forces for different panels, including energy and digital connectivity, were put together. And these tried to bring in experts from different countries and different parts of the world. And initially our meetings were held virtually, and we initially tried to contribute our thoughts to what kind of ideas and what kind of policies should go into the T20 outcome document. And when the G20 and the T20 process, I think, really began in earnest in earlier this year, when the entire group was called to Delhi for a face-to-face meeting. And other than that, so some of the topics that had already been brought up earlier, including support for renewable energy, including climate finance, and so on, and final points of these were discussed on a face-to-face basis. Initially, only ideas were put up, and also at this time, a lot of policy briefs had started coming in from contributors externally, which also had to be read. And I think we got we got a few hundred such policy briefs. So these were also divided amongst different group members for their thoughts and their ideas. And eventually this culminated in the meeting in Mysore. I wasn't able to attend the final meeting due to some other commitments. But really this was the process. And I think at multiple stages, we tried to accommodate different ideas to the extent that was possible. And that was really one of the good parts of the whole process. And it also brought together, we also ended up working with experts from different countries. And you also get to see the priorities that different people and different countries have, which was also a big experience.
Mr. Nan, your thoughts?
I think while reading the G20 Leaders Declaration, what I found very promising was the language that was there. It mentions inclusive and just transition, in the sense it talks about moving forward by taking everyone along. And I think that was a theme which was recurring across our meetings in T20. And I hope that, all of the thinking that was done at the T20 has in some ways shaped or in some ways influenced what we're seeing in the G20 process. What I saw was there was a broad consensus amongst developing country participants and even some developed country participants on the measures that are being taken by the West or the global North, and how developing countries need to shape the narrative as well as to put forth their priorities. Which again comes across quite clearly from the document of the declaration, which talks about thinking about national and development priorities alongside thinking of the challenges of the transition that we're seeing.
Thanks a lot for your thoughts, Amit and Suranjali. Now, my first question is around incentives and subsidies to industries and consumers alike, and how FAME 1 and 2 have shaped up the progress so far, and what can we expect from FAME 3? Amit, if you can please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Akash. First and foremost, subsidies have played a fairly big role in adoption of electric vehicles in India up to now. So FAME 2, I believe, had a budgetary support of around 10,000 crore rupees. And I think another 18,000 crores was the outlay which was put together for the production linked incentives for electric vehicles. So these have clearly played some role in adoption of EVs up to now. There have also been some additional measures, including the reduced GST on EVs that is there in India compared to diesel and petrol vehicles, as well as easing up of, there are certain kind of permits you don't require if you're operating an electric vehicle. So these have definitely helped in a big way. And one of the outcomes that we can see is that the total electric vehicles sales in India in 2022 crossed the 1 million mark. And I think the total number of electric vehicles that are there on road is just over 2 million. It is worth pointing out that this number is still less than 1% of all the vehicles on road, one. And two, most of these EVs that are currently on roads are two-wheelers, which are a relatively small part of the total oil demand. Nevertheless, 1 million and 2 million are important benchmarks. Under FAME 2, I think one of the expectations is that the government will increase the outlay, which has been set aside. So I think the number being talked about is 40 to 50,000 crore. And larger outlay simply means that more support can be provided in different ways. More production-linked incentives, and especially for manufacture of batteries. Battery cells currently for EVs are almost entirely imported in India, and that's a big part of the EV value. That's all, Akash.
Amit, you mentioned about two and three wheelers, and we have recently seen global biofuel alliance coming up, and there have been some momentum push from the Indian government for biofuels, and that coupled with hydrogen for mobility, whether it is in large cargoes or shipping or aviation. Are we seeing electric mobility revolution sort of constricted to two, three, four-wheelers and buses to say max? And we are looking at a scenario where road transportation, cargo freight will be more inclined towards hydrogen. That also is, that also will be the hydrogen will also to uh,
lithium or an electric vehicle can petrol really is two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and four-wheelers. So that is where we are seeing most of the action. Because you mentioned the point about hydrogen, more promising alternatives, which probably a need for lithium batteries. So you can vehicle apart from the storage of which will hydrogen. Rest of the chemistry way the vehicle operates practically remains the same. And challenges in storing and handling hydrogen, for example, to convert hydrogen to X temperatures, which are not easy to achieve. It's the issue that hydrogen itself has a very low amounts of energy. Technically, duty after truck on hydrogen than simply leave. And there is also national hydrogen. So we may have more promise in certain parts of the EV.
Okay, Suranjali, my next question is to you. Thoughts on public-private partnership and community-based funding for the infrastructure, which is so far has been a big bottleneck when we talk about expanding the electric mobility uniformly throughout each and every region of India.
Thanks, Akash. I think any conversation on e-mobility almost stalls when we talk about what are the charging facilities, because it requires logistically for an end-to-end connectivity for a vehicle to travel long distances. And I think in this regard, there's been a shortfall. So you're right, you're saying that there are questions around whether this facility will be available in semi-urban, in rural areas. There's also the question of to what scale are they available at the moment. So then a bunch of numbers floating around, but whichever way you look at it, in terms of what is required is about CII calculates at about 1.3 million charging points, which are required based on a ratio of 1:40. One charging station for 40 EVs. And so that requires a lot of scaling up. Now, I think what needs to be done, as you're rightly asking me the question on public-private partnership, is that to imagine that when companies are producing EVs, they also require the fuel in some ways to run it, and so therefore there are network effects, right? So which we've seen even in the adoption of other technologies, and for that, I feel that there is some incentive already for companies to push this. So there could be diversion of some capex from companies which are in the automotive or automobile industry to invest in such infrastructure. But then there are cost questions. So for example, at what price would this power to cars be provided? So what is the unit cost? And is there any subsidy to be given in the process of providing these charging facilities? And for that, I think the public finance angle becomes extremely important. I think there are a couple of ways in which this can be imagined. One is that there would be existing land which is available to certain private entities. There could be some incentives linked to the use of that land already within the balance sheets for setting up of these charging facilities, and there would be a revenue sharing model. There could also be scaling up of some capacity through loans which are given to the public sector, to the government, on creating these facilities, which can over a period of time, if they are in a sense revenue generating, can be transferred to private entities. So there are different ways to imagine this, but I would say that it requires equal effort, both from the side of the public finance as well as private finance. And there is incentive enough for private finance to put their money in, because as they're scaling their output, there's also need for scaling up the input which is used for the EVs.
Right. So when we talk about pricing of these vehicles, and this has come across several times through our interactions with automotive dealers and financier banks and other institutions, consumers as well, that the cost of financing for EVs, whether it is 2, 3, or 4-wheeler, is significantly higher than conventional vehicles. Same goes with insurances and other registration and processing fees, although there are some exemptions. But how can we counter these high cost of financing in terms of insurance and market financing? And where is the role of financial institutions, NBFCs, and banks to make electric vehicles more accessible to consumers? When we say accessible, at least have a level playing field in terms of ICE vehicles, so that the whole cost of financing is at par, or even in the case significantly lower than the ICE vehicle. So where do you see the role of NBFCs and banks in that? Suranjali?
Yeah, so I think what is happening is that there is some kind of accentuation of risks which is associated with EVs, and I think the way to change the pricing of it is also to find ways to at least communicate to the financial institutions about the stability of the technology. Until that happens, you might see a higher premium of insurance, you might even see higher costs. I think what can be done at the moment is what is already being done in some ways, is to give a tax break. So for example, the GST rates that we've just spoken of already, they are lower on EVs. Also deductibility of loan which are taken for EVs from incomes of individuals. And I think those are mechanisms to the cost of purchase. And I think that can be an important way to change the way or change the costs to the consumers at the moment. But I would imagine that this is not a static. There will be change in technology costs, as well as there would be change in dependency or reliance of the technology as well. So once the stability kicks in, there would be changes in the cost that you're seeing right now.
Thanks, Suranjali. Yeah, please go ahead, Amit.
So there is one other aspect which I would also like to bring in terms of financing. So when you look at a vehicle like a car or a taxi or a truck, there is an entire life cycle where that vehicle is used for 20-25 years. So a truck very rarely is used by a single owner throughout its 20-year lifetime. In the first 5 or 10 years, it is 5 or 7 years, it is used by one user. Then it goes to user number 2. So the resale value of a vehicle is a very important part of the overall cost consideration. So this is one thing. This is one thing which affects the value at which that vehicle is being financed. If I don't know if I repossess a truck on which an installment has not been paid, I can recover a large part of my borrowing by selling that truck in the resale market, because there is a very well-established market for second-hand, let's say, diesel trucks. A similar market at this point does not exist for EVs and other such renewable equipment, which makes it difficult for a financier to adequately, as you said, offer good rates. So one part will also be to try and create or catalyze a resale market for these kind of vehicles. And as the number on the road increases, we will find that after 5 or 6 years, there are second-hand and pre-owned vehicles which are coming into the market. So this also will have to be something that the policymakers will have to contend with.
Sure, Amit. Since you spoke about trucks, one thing that I have always wondered is that the cost differential when we talk about 2, 3, or 4-wheeler is not significantly higher. But in terms of trucks, we can say the cost differential is around 2 to 2.5 times vis-a-vis ICE to electric vehicles. So would that be a hindrance or an obstacle in uniform adoption in cargo or commercial sector, or are we looking at some special financial mechanisms put in place specifically for the trucking sector?
I think right now the reason why I don't think there are any heavy trucks. The trucks that you are referring to are probably the lighter trucks, the small load trucks which are typically used within cities. For heavy trucks right now, there isn't a real option in EVs, although there are a number of hydrogen fueled trucks which do work. Now the idea is that what I pointed out earlier is that lithium generally has a very low energy density compared to petroleum. In a car, it doesn't matter. If your battery weighs an extra 100 or 200 kilos versus the fuel tank, that doesn't matter. The moment you transport a heavy battery onto a truck, you have to make a number of compromises. This is an old research paper and the numbers may have changed. But let's say if a 35-ton truck has to, a 35-ton electric truck has to be run entirely on electricity, it would require a battery which was, this is a 2020 calculation, which would require a 19-ton battery. So that means, will the truck carry its battery or will it carry the load? That completely destroys the financing, the financial aspect of transport. So I think in case of lighter trucks, these payoffs are not there because you're riding within a city, but you do still require a heavy battery. Batteries do have a life, so many recharge cycles after which they need to be replaced. And that makes and unlike a private vehicle, which is used sparingly, most private vehicles don't get used on a daily basis for hours and hours. A commercial vehicle gets used on a regular basis, so many hours a day. So these batteries go through that many cycles, require replacement. I think that makes the trucks even more expensive.
So now that we have touched upon the battery size and weight of the battery aspect, I would like to know from both of you your thoughts on battery leasing and swapping programs that are at a very nascent stage in India. But if scaled up, how would these impact the affordability and convenience of electric vehicle ownership in terms of cost and convenience? And would it be feasible to expand it to 4-wheeler segment as well? Suranjali, you can go ahead first, please.
No, I think I'll have to concede to Amit because he seems to know the market much better. But just from my my understanding of what I've read is that while it's a solution that is being offered, at the end of it, someone is going to have to be standing with the costs of this, battery, which will be replaced at its end of the life cycle. So who is going to bear the cost? Is it going to be that we're imagining some kind of public finance support, or there could be more financial instruments being devised, which are in a way hedges against the costs associated with the replacement. So while it would not be the responsibility or be borne by the end consumer, there still needs to be some thinking on what the financial structures will be to support this, and whether this will be feasible to be scaled up in a country like India.
Amit, if you can shed some light on this.
Like for us to come with that policy like that would require certain standardizations. So, for example, if you have to be able to swap, let's say, a two-wheeler battery, then all two-wheeler batteries will have to be identical in shape, size, capacity, in many ways, because it should not happen that I have a battery X and the battery I get after charging is, let's say, battery Y, which is of only half the capacity, or which is of a much lower power rating. So there has to be a certain standardization that would be required. That is one. The second part is that there is also an issue of practicality. So electric EV batteries can be very large and extremely bulky. So just to give you an example, and it may not be entirely relevant for India, but it gives you a problem of the scale that the battery pack of a Tesla vehicle, Tesla car, is typically around 500 kilos. That is massive, right? You cannot remove or easily replace these without some specialized equipment. So the moment you talk of specialized equipment, I mean, Suranjali pointed out the cost aspect of battery swapping, which is all the spare batteries floating around. But you're also talking about a large bank of high-tech and specialized infrastructure equipment, which will have to be created across the place. It may not be practical everywhere. So in a large city, a metropolis, you can probably have this kind of infrastructure, but it may not be practicable for all the smaller locations as well. And it may also mean, so if I automate the process by which, let's say, a vehicle can be opened up and the battery pack replaced, I am also probably talking about standardized designs for vehicles as well. And I'm not very certain how that is going to get accomplished. So that is one. So probably if the batteries are small and portable, this is easily done. With larger batteries, we'll have to answer a lot of other questions. And finally, it is also important to avoid mission creep. You know, with government dictating everything from battery design, battery chemistry, vehicle design, refueling station design, because one of the experiences we have had in India in the last 30 odd years is that as the government got out of business, the economy did start to grow more substantially and we became more efficient at the use of capital. So too much government interference or direction is also not a good thing. I think we will probably have to take it slow and wait and watch to see how the sector evolves.
Here, I would like to mention one point that what I understand is once the battery efficiency goes down below 80%, it needs to be replaced. And then the potential use of that battery is into grid storage systems, utility scale storage system. Correct me if I'm wrong. But then there is a need to have that market of batteries moving from electric vehicles to utility scale storage systems, and agencies facilitating that transition. That also needs to be regulated sooner or later. At least when we will have first life cycle of some major four-wheeler segment comes to an end 5 years, 7 years, 8 years down the line. How do you see that happening? Or if we are looking at a very sort of destructured, unregulated market wherein people buy in these batteries and somehow sell it to the other buyers, and there are potential possibilities of resource not effective resource utilization. I just wanted to know your thoughts on that. Amit, you can
okay. Yeah. So, okay, now we have an example of lithium batteries, rechargeable lithium batteries. We use them in our cell phones all the time. And I think most of us noticed that after 300 or 500 cycles, there is a significant reduction in the amount of energy they store. So that gives you an estimate on at what point will you need to replace these batteries. So that is one. Second, I think what you said, that within 3 or 5 years of the vehicle sale, there is going to be a large bank of second-hand batteries which will come into the market. So those 2 points are correct. Now, do we recycle these batteries immediately, or do we use them in other applications which are static and which are not mobile? Now, specifically in the Indian context, I see there are some challenges, and one of them is really the financial viability of India's power sector. So when we look at India's power sector as a whole, it is largely government-owned distribution companies which do most of the power distribution. Collectively, I think around 21 or 22% of electricity is not paid for technical and commercial losses. And I think another 21-22% is for the farm sector, which is also at very nominal rates. So you're really looking at a sector where 40% of the product doesn't get a revenue. And the problem here, therefore, arises is that the power sector collectively is bankrupt in India. And this is also something which is now being felt by many of the renewable energy generation companies in the country, that SEBs are sometimes unable to pay for the wind or solar power that they have contracted in the past. So the question would be that to make a market for these batteries, and this brings the point which we discussed earlier, that for equipment to be viable, a large part of the vehicle cost is going to be battery cost. For the financing market for vehicles to be viable, there has to be a resale market for batteries as well. So I need a resale market for batteries, but the customer who will buy these batteries, the power utility, is somebody who is financially on the verge, or bankrupt in all but name. So to make an effective market here, we will also need to work on certain reforms in the power sector, specifically looking at financial viability of the distribution and the generation companies, without which it will be difficult to make the system work. So it is a complicated system, multiple moving parts, many issues. And so it is not just a challenge of, let's say, battery design or battery chemistry, but also a challenge of making the economics or the commercial aspect work.
Thanks, Amit. Suranjali, now coming to the point of innovative finance that we have chosen as our subject today, how multilateral development banks or even private capital markets can expedite international funding or investment initiatives to expedite this market or to accelerate this market, and to ensure that the funding that has been provided for particular sector is directly availed by that particular sector. We have seen issues of lots of funding coming up and then lost throughout the chain some amount of, so effective transition of funds from international agencies to particular sector. And if there are any examples that you can cite, that would be great.
Yeah, Akash, I think transport is one of the important chunks within the energy transition conversation where a shift needs to happen. And like the other sectors as well, the question here is who's going to finance. And I think the other question which is related to this is what is it that needs to be financed. So as I can see, there are different parts of it. If you look at private sector investment, there are companies in the automobile sector which are already looking at a future of EVs. And, there's been an announcement of capital investment of upwards of 80,000 crores on building capacity. And I think that's one leg of financing that will come through existing capacities within balance sheets of companies. There are ways to scale that up. We've seen that, there's been much talk about the issue of green bonds, which is still a debt instrument, and we have to check whether companies are still very excited about putting more debt on their balance sheets. But that's one way to do it. The other, I believe, would be startups being encouraged. And so there have been use of accelerator programs where I think there could be venture capitalists and private equity could pitch in money. I think the big question mark there is the use case of technologies and how developed they are, because there's always this risk whether this will work or won't. And I think as the market matures, where some of the technologies are validated, it is possible to scale up finance to this. The other element is how do you get people into the market? How do you get people to buy EVs, which is also related to what you were asking earlier. On how do you direct debt towards people who are looking to buy? And I think there have been innovations there as well. There have been platforms that have been created which also tend tend to match the borrowers from with the financial institutions, and this could be at the company level. But I would imagine that there would be ways of pricing debt better for consumers. Uh, there's a lot of talk even at the G20 on the MDBs, but I think there has to be at least a pragmatic thinking on where we want them to sort of pitch in. In this entire puzzle, of course, it's all infrastructure, which we've seen where MDBs come in best. And maybe the charging infrastructure, which we're imagining, which needs to be built in parts where there may not be immediate sense that this is profitable for companies itself. I think that's one place where we could imagine the scaling up of international public finance. And I think one other instrument which will help companies move, whether it is in terms of switching to EVs within their own logistic network, as well as the production of EVs, is the disclosure framework. So now investors are beginning to ask companies on what their emissions are for different scope. And I think that could actually shift a lot of things for how companies operate, even in terms of their supply chain. So with the BRSR becoming more prevalent and widely reported, I think you might see a shift in finance along with that. In terms of international practices, I think a bunch of these have been tried, but there are international facilities. So if you look at, for example, some of the EU countries, like Germany or France or UK, which is not in EU, but is in the continent, one of the factors that drive the uptake of EV, as well as the shift in mobility, is through the use of incentives and subsidies. And, of course, remaining cognizant of whatever public finance space is available to countries. I think one of the ways to shift the demand side is, as we're already seeing being playing out in India, as I mentioned earlier. So you have differential rates of tax. You could have some level of support in terms of direct subsidies on this could even be for R&D, and so that could drive the shift as we see that the private sector investment is scaled alongside. There's also a coalition of UNEP, UNEP with EBRD, ADB, which is looking at ways of finding financing the scale up finance.
Suranjali, you broke up for a second, but we got what you were saying. Thanks. Amit, you wanted to add some more points on that.
Yeah. So Suranjali mentioned about the green bonds, and I think one of the sort of sore points between developing world and the West has been on issue of $100 billion of climate finance. But that aside, I think private equity is one area and one sector which has actually been extremely active in supporting electric vehicles as compared to climate finance, which comes from governments. And the reason obviously for that is that these are investors who are looking for a profit, and the most valuable auto companies in the world today are the EV companies, because they may not be exactly viable at a global level today, but that is clearly where a lot of people see the future. Now, in the Indian context, there are a number of EV-related startups. Many of them, of course, there is Bajaj TVS, there are Bajaj TVS and Hero, which are big on EVs. But there are also companies like Ola Electric, Ather Energy, and Okinawa, which are really startups, which don't come from an automobile or a business background, but they also don't have access to capital. Many of these companies have been able to successfully raise funds from global investors via the private equity route. A very good example is Ola Electric, which is, I think, just raised about $140 million. The round was led by, I think, Temasek, the Singaporean fund. This was in the last 15 days or so. And similarly, Okinawa, which again is a two-wheeler manufacturer and it is not quite like a Bajaj or a Hero, was able to successfully raise $50 million from a group of foreign investors in October of last year. So many of these companies are startups. They have less access to capital, but also they have less to lose. They are more in a position to run with a promising idea. And private equity often makes it easier for these smaller companies to compete. So anything that the government can do to encourage private equity is something they should definitely look at, because very often these investors are more nimble as compared to, let's say, government lenders, or and they are much faster to market as well.
Thanks, Amit. Very interesting insights on this particular question. And that brings to my next question on corporate fleets and businesses. So by 2025, we are looking at somewhere 13 million, rides, commercial rides through platforms like Ola, Uber, and Rapido, and what other companies are there. And would it make sense to have some mandates for these fleet owners to have their vehicles transition into electric category, whether it is two-wheeler or four-wheeler, in product or delivery services or passenger commute services? Would that make sense?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, please.
Can I go first? I do not think the government should come in with quotas. I think we are all of an age where we remember a country that was heavily socialist pre-1991. Government had a voice in everything, how you have to do things. It does not work. I think government mandated quotas on how much your fleet should be, how much of your fleet should be EV, diesel, or something else is a very bad idea. At best, government can set certain norms for emissions, maybe certain norms on that this is the amount of emission you can have on a per mile or a per whatever basis. But having quotas in terms of this much of your fleet should be EV is an absolutely bad idea. Also, let's not forget that, I mean, there is a euphoria around EVs. We see the market value of companies like Ola and others. But let us remember that even at this point, these electric vehicles do not strictly compare performance-wise with diesel and petrol vehicles at this point of time. So forcing a less efficient, I mean, as a private user, I can afford to buy a less efficient vehicle because I think that a certain causes of value, that is fine. Forcing a commercial user to make certain choices by sheer regulation, making a less efficient choice is probably not a good idea. Also, if you force transporters to use a less efficient solution, you will see costs of that trickling down elsewhere in the economy. Less efficient logistics, probably, or other problems that come up. So I would simply say, don't go for the quotas. The market seems to be doing a reasonably good job of allocating capital, and we have seen that happening with the electric two-wheeler companies. Accelerate and catalyze that process by all means, but do not dictate.
Suranjali, your thoughts on this or any other similar interventions required?
Yeah, Akash, I think mostly when I argue in favor of the transition to say what we can use, what instruments we can use, I think what is critical is the pricing of carbon emissions. So which is already being done through differential rates of tax, which are applicable. So that's one way to do it. I think the development of voluntary carbon markets, I think that's another useful way to do this. It prices any excess emissions, and so therefore can, in a way, limit the use of fossil fuel based equipment, which is including the cars that we're seeing today. So I think that's one way to do it. There's no merit in trying to dictate what the mix of the fleet should look like.
Thanks, Suranjali. Amit, you spoke about reforms in power sector. So that brings me to this question that going forward, when we'll see more penetration of electric vehicles in the mix, and probably most of the consumers will be charging their vehicles at a particular time, let's say late in the night or in the morning. would that affect, the load in the system, and how integrating that with smart grid systems could contribute to cost effectiveness and efficiency of the whole network?
Okay, so I would probably not cover the smart grid part in great detail. But yes, first of all, if you are charging a large fleet of vehicles, you are going to put load on the system, one. Secondly, we do, and a lot of people feel that electric vehicles can be a good way to balance out the intermittency of renewable energy. We get solar power only for around 6 or 7 hours a day, and wind energy is not in the same time frame, but wind energy also comes with a certain intermittency. So having a large fleet of batteries is probably a good way to store this electricity. That is fine. But I think what will also happen is, I mean, you are generating solar power during the daytime. You cannot charge your vehicle at night time using that. I mean, one of the possibilities can be that you charge your batteries at daytime, use them to run your equipment at night. But then again, there are some other issues with it. I would say that at this point of time, anyway, the idea is that whichever solution we go with, we are looking at some substantial investments in the power sector, including in the grid and also in some storage infrastructure. The problem at this point of time is that given the sort of collective, I don't use the word loosely, bankruptcy of the power sector, these investments are practically out of the question for Indian generation companies. So I think at this point of time, also it is worth remembering, at this point of time, around 75% of our electricity comes from coal. And I do not see this number changing very meaningfully in the next 10 years or so. So if we are, renewable energy has probably reached as far as it can, in my personal opinion, as it can without some significant reforms to the financials of the power sector. So if we are looking at EVs that are going to be charged by electricity that is 75% coal, then we also will have to ask some uncomfortable questions. Are we just shifting the point at which the emission is taking place? And of course, there are certain other issues that will come up. So I think unless the financial viability of power sector is addressed, we will not be able to see investments in the grid or investments in green energy, and that will have to be factored into the EV equation, in my view.
Thanks, Amit. That brings to my last question for today's podcast, and this is for both of you, Suranjali and Amit. I would like to know your thoughts on at least two possible interventions, whether they are at policy level or market level, or any financial interventions that we can effectively transition from an ICE automotive system to electric vehicle ecosystem. That is also justifies the idea of a just transition, and also meets the targets that we have envisaged by 2030. Just two ideas that you can think and work. Suranjali, you can go ahead, please.
Yeah, so Akash, I think in terms of just two recommendations, I think one is more generic, and I think that applies to most of our transition challenges, is to be able to price, because how do you set a target and expect a sector to transition? So you set a price through voluntary carbon markets as well as taxes. So I think these are going to continue to play an important role in how we shape our mobility sector. I think the second one, which is really important, is that companies will do what they're doing. They will produce, once you have measures in place, they will begin to produce EVs. But what do you do with EVs if you don't have infra? And I think the second one, which needs to be focused on, is the infrastructure pipeline around it. There's a lot of way to do this. There's already thinking in India on scaling up of infrastructure financing, and there are project lists. And so therefore identifying how how the charging facilities, for example, or the R&D or for the development of batteries in India, and the manufacturing hubs, how do they tie in with the overall plan or economic priorities that India has, in probably putting them at the forefront might be two useful ways of making this happen.
Amit, your thoughts?
Yeah. So two suggestions would be that you have asked for. One would be, of course, to make it easier for new and promising business ideas to raise capital. So right now, the examples I gave you of private equity funding for companies like Ola and Ether, these are companies which have reached a certain scale and of course are able to tap the venture capital market, which looks at deals of a certain size. I think we also need to enable this kind of fundraising for smaller ticket sizes, what would really come in the angel funding category. So more funding for new and promising ideas, even at smaller scales. That is something which will probably help find new. I mean, we have to do and fail at more things. Some of them eventually succeed, and that is generally how any new industry evolves. That is one. The second idea is that, and this is something which is already being done to a certain extent. In some of the larger cities, the city bus transport fleet is gradually shifting to electric vehicles. And the idea here is that these buses operate at a high frequency and at a high high level of usage, but they operate in a infrastructure dense environment, and they don't run into challenges that, let's say, a vehicle on the highway will run into. So identify instances of gated infrastructure where large number of vehicles are required, and examples of that would be, let's say, an airport, or let's say a warehouse which requires a large number of forklift trucks and other vehicles, and even a port. Gated infrastructure can afford to provide, I don't need to set up a cross-country infrastructure of electric vehicle charging stations if I'm running a warehouse. So gated infrastructure can be one place which can provide a large demand for EVs, one, that can help fine-tune the technologies, and it will also help us identify the other challenges that are going to come up. So, for instance, the issue of resale value of vehicles, and there are going to be many more such. Gated infrastructure gives us a way to test these things out without wholesale and widespread adoption across the board.
Thanks, Amit. And this also brings to an end of our stipulated time for this podcast. Anything else from any of you that you would like to mention that we missed, that we do could be a potential game changer for the market?
I think you covered pretty well. Nothing from my side.
Nothing from my side either, Akash. Thank you so much.
All right. Suranjali, Amit, thank you so much for giving us time to participate in this podcast.